Hey everybody, geeks and geekettes, nerds everywhere, comic aficionados, and just pop culture maniacs. Welcome to another edition of Ask Chuck Dixon, where you ask me questions about what I do for a living. What I do for a living is I write comic books. Who the hell am I? and what right do I have to answer these questions? Well, I've been writing comics professionally for over 35 years. And I was on an amateur status for a long time before that. And I've written literally thousands of comics and worked for every major company, worked with hundreds of great artists and editors and all the rest of it. And as anyone can attest who's watched these videos, I give rather frank and candid answers about what I do for a living. So, and my history in the business. Speaking of business, little housekeeping up front. If you go to Subscribestar and look for my name, Chuck Dixon, you can subscribe. And by subscribing, you get a ride ticket, a Dixonverse ride ticket, which if you submit, the instructions are there on the site. And I will message you instructions as well when you join. The ride ticket entitles you to a whole bunch of goodies. A starter pack of actual physical copies of comics and special items, all signed by me. And after that, there will be physical items and digital items. Every month you'll get something from me in exchange for your subscription. So you go to Subscribestar and look for my name. You'll see the link down below this video. Another thing that I just found out about is YouTube has started offering super thanks. If you look down at the bottom of the screen there, you might see this little heart with a $sign in it. Seems like an oxymoron to me. Love of money right there in one little symbol. So you can throw a few bucks my way apparently just by clicking and helps me out. It helps me move these. I want to get back on a weekly basis with these episodes, but as I've explained before, I got to justify my time because it takes time away from the writing, which is what I actually do for a living. But if I could get some cash basically to pay the bills and allow me to sit at the dinner table and look my family in the eye with pride, a few bucks would help. So if you want to go to Super Thanks, if you like this video, and then throw a few shekels my way. This week's dog is brought to you by Joseph Lewis, who sent us a wonderful picture of his dog, Buddy. And that is an awesome dog. And that's an awesome picture as well. Wow. Good job, Buddy. Good dog. And Brian David Schwartz. So I noticed over the years that you wrote stories about orphans, as in Detective 722, and a backup in Punisher Holiday Special number 3. I've written thousands of comics. 2 comics is not exactly a trend. Any special significance about the orphan to you, or were you following up on a trope no longer in fashion? I'm not an orphan. I'm not adopted. Whatever for what that's worth. But the orphan is it's a part of pop culture. It's part of literature going back forever. And it's a big part of comics. There's an awful lot of comic book characters, iconic comic book characters, who are orphans. Batman and, Tarzan. He's an orphan. Superman, famously an orphan. Spider-Man, Daredevil. The list goes on and on and on of characters in comics who are orphaned. And part of the reason that writers do this is to shed an unnecessary ancillary cast. It's why in early TV comedies you saw so many widows and widowers were the leads in the situation comedy, so they didn't have to deal with a married couple issues and just deal with whatever the goofy setup was that week. And the other reason is the orphan starts out as an underdog, and as an orphan, as we learn from Superman, Batman, Oliver Twist, Tarzan, all the rest, being born an orphan begins a journey of discovery about who you really are. And in the fantasy involving orphans, of course, the orphan turns out to be someone very special, and that's a fantasy we all have, that one day we find out, we get a letter in the mail or a limousine shows up at the front door and tells us that, we're not just this mundane slob of a person. We're actually, very, very special person. We just never knew it because our real parents were fabulously wealthy or royalty or had superpowers or whatever. So the orphan is a trope. I mean, Dickens populated all of his stories with orphans who had, mysterious pasts that they learn about themselves. So it's just a common thing. I've used them occasionally in stories. I think I've used just about every kind of character in stories by this point. But I don't think that it's gone out of fashion. I mean, Harry Potter, unless I'm aging myself, Harry Potter is now considered old hat. Stories are still on TV and in comics and novels and everything else, still populated with a whole bunch of parentless kids looking for their true place in life. It's just, it's a fictional thing. Everybody's used it. So there you go. Elias, oh man, I'm going to kill this. Wengel? Or Wengel. Okay, let's stick with that. Did you read Cordo Maltese by Hugo Pratt? Cordo Maltese, yeah. Cordo Maltese, Hugo Pratt, often considered to be a great European artist, is actually a great Argentinian artist. As I learned when I visited Argentina, so many of my favorite European artists were actually from Buenos Aires. They weren't European at all. Something in the water down there. But Hugo Pratt created Cordo Maltese. If you've never read them, Dee Melania has republished them in really terrific, oversized paperback volumes that you can still get. These aren't them, but and Dean has taken pains to translate them from the original Italian. Pratt wrote them in Italian, and he's taken pains to do new translations that are more colloquial and much better reads. Dean's done a terrific job with Cordo, and these are the best English language editions you'll ever find. I always had a problem with previous English language editions because they were literally translated but not colloquially translated, if you know what I mean. And I'm having a hard time with the word colloquial, yeah, they were literal translations, but they weren't artful translations. They weren't entertaining. The dialogue was kind of dead. It's almost as if Google Translate done them. But Dean is taking great pains, as he always does with his reprint editions, and made sure that these are the most readable versions of Cordo. Now, if you don't know who Cordo Maltese is, he's a sort of a drifter, a sailor of sorts, and he travels the world, often by sea, to all these different places at the early part of the 20th century. So he's there for things like, the Russian Revolution and stuff like that. It's Jack London type stuff, and but there's a philosophical undercut. I had to confess, some of his more philosophical stories sort of turned me off. There's an entire volume that's kind of hallucinogenic, and it didn't appeal to me. But Pratt was a master storyteller, master of minimalist art. Just a terrific artist. I mean, he didn't draw what wasn't necessary. Very much of the Alex Toth school. An artist most Americans are more familiar with for his minimalist style, but extremely influential. Pratt and Cordo Maltese, extremely influential to the art world. Very much an artist's artist. When you get a bunch of comic artists together, his name often comes up. And of course, in Argentina, he's worshipped like a comic book god. So Cordo Maltese, yeah, I have read it. I do enjoy them. I have reread them. Plus some of his other volumes. He did other things other than Cordo Maltese. And he did an excellent graphic novel about the Desert War in Africa in World War II. Stuff like that. Yep, great artist, great series. You should check it out. Jeremy Wenzel. Given your like of slob main characters and pulp, which actor has best portrayed your ideal Philip Marlowe? Philip Marlowe, private detective, created by Raymond Chandler. I'm going to go through them all. What the heck? What the heck? Powers Booth, I've never watched these. I just want to get this out of the way right away. There was an HBO series with Powers Booth as Philip Marlowe, and I never watched them. I liked Powers Booth. I think he was perfectly cast as Phil Marlowe, but this was a series in the 80s, and in my experience in the 80s, when they tried to do period stuff, there was something wrong with it. There was something off. It still looked like the 80s, as you can tell by this woman's eye makeup. It's just something was never right about it. It was always too clean, too colorful. I mean, maybe if somebody writes and convinces me that these are worth watching, I will watch them. Because as I said, I like Powers Booth a lot, and I think he's perfectly cast. But I want to get it out of the way. Never seen him. Okay, Bogart, The Big Sleep, played Phil Marlowe. Great Howard Hawks film. I love Bogart. I don't think he was right for Philip Marlowe. Perfect for Sam Spade, not right for Philip Marlowe. You refer to Marlowe as a slob hero. I don't really think Marlowe fits into the slob hero category. Ross MacDonald wrote of Raymond Chandler that Chandler wrote like a slumming angel. In other words, he wrote about stuff that was beneath him. Chandler was a lawyer and well educated, and he imbues Philip Marlowe with a lot of that. So Marlowe's a lot smarter than the people he's dealing with. He's quicker. That's why he's such a wise ass in the stories. And he's dealing with a lot of dumb people. And, they're not beneath him because he wants to help people, which is the angel part. But he is slumming. And Bogart, I think, got a little too into the, he played him as too much of a tough guy, not enough of a wise ass. Mitchum, very much again, played him as a slob hero, a guy who's past his prime and leaning into being a tough guy. Mitchum played Marlowe in two films in the 70s. And they're both good. The first one, Farewell, My Lovely, being the superior one. But again, they suffer from that period's, the 70s and 80s, where they did period stuff and it just looked a little too clean, there was something phony about it. It didn't look real. Say what you want about movies and television today, but when they do period stuff, they take pains to make it look in period. And in the 70s and 80s, either there wasn't the budget or the interest or whatever, or maybe they weren't far enough away from the 40s to see what they were doing wrong, whatever. But yeah, I like Mitchum, but again, he's too much of the slob hero, not enough. You don't get the idea that he's college educated, which we get the idea Phil Marlowe was. James Garner in the 60s, this is a movie that's grown on me. It's just called Marlowe. Garner's a good choice. Again, always good as a wise ass, always good as a private detective. But it gets a little silly. But it's a good adaptation of Chandler's novel, The Little Sister. And it makes clear all the twists and turns. Because as I've said in previous videos, Chandler wasn't exactly the keenest plotter in the world. He would leave subplots dangling and questions unanswered. And the screenplay here does a good job of cleaning that up. But it's very 60s. And to me, Marlowe belongs in the 30s or 40s. Robert Montgomery played Marlowe in an unusual film in which he's never seen. The entire film is shot from his perspective. The only time we see him is when he looks in a mirror. Unusual. It's A Lady in the Lake. And Montgomery's close. He's close to what I think Marlowe should be like. He's obviously sophisticated. He's fallen down from the upper classes. He's educated. He looks the part. Montgomery is an actor a lot of us forget. He's pretty much forgotten, but extremely popular during his career, and a war hero, and father of Elizabeth Montgomery of Bewitched, just to dump some more trivia on you. But yeah, he's close. But for my money, Dick Powell nails it. In a movie called Murder, My Sweet, which is based on Farewell, My Lovely, Dick Powell, he could toss off a wise-ass line. He just threw lines away. He didn't step on them. He didn't emphasize them. And for me, he's my favorite Marlowe. He seems like a guy who had better days and is now prowling the streets of LA just trying to help out, for $50 a day plus expenses. And or maybe it was $20 a day plus expenses. I can't remember. But, he looks good in the part. He's believable. Powell was sort of turned himself around after World War II. Prior to World War II, he was a pretty boy singing and dancing guy in musicals. And like so many actors following World War II, he kind of had to reinvent himself. And he made a series of really excellent noir movies. And I throw this one into the pile. It's Murder My Sweet. It's definitely worth checking out. Now, if I had to pick anybody, and I don't have a picture of him, but if I could have picked any actor in any period who would have been the perfect Marlowe, I think William Holden in the 1950s would have been the perfect Marlowe. He had the height and everything else, and he had that sort of look of someone who was privileged at one time and lost it. Holden was good at playing roles like that, of a guy who his best days were behind him. And that is very much Phil Marlowe. His best days are behind him. He's now just swimming against the tide and trying to, save a few people from drowning. Okay. Hutch. Hutch presents a question that's possibly longer than any of the answers this week, but that's Hutch. In Bane's first appearance, he mocks that Batman, who is struggling to save a henchman from falling to his death, won't even break the sixth commandment. My question is about Batman and his rule against killing. Superman has one too. We know that the DC Comics movies are made by people who may have a nominal understanding of the characters at best. You're being generous. Which is why, since 1989, Batman has guns on all his vehicles, and he tends to kill people, or at least not care about henchmen dying by his actions when he sets off bombs. Movie Batman is more like James Bond with a cape. Now we go on to the second part. Most recently, Zack Snyder had Superman break General Zod's neck, and while all fans were still in shock from that, in the next movie, Batman begins intentionally murdering dozens of henchmen with his car and his fists. Snyder and others of late seem to be voicing the opinion that the only reason Superman and Batman don't kill is that they need to be written for babies. And now that they're written for grown-ups, that's not a concern. I know that the no-killing rule was added after the first few years of adventures for both characters while they were still being fleshed out, but I can't help but think that it's important to who they are as people. How do you feel about this rule? Or was your following it just because Denny O'Neil had the no-killing policy? Well, I mean, number one, I agreed with Denny on the no-killing policy. I didn't want a Batman or I'm perfectly willing to write lethal characters. I think I've proven that with my Punisher and long runs on Conan and my novels and things like that. I have no problem with heroes who off characters. I have no problem with James Bond. Killing a guy and then making some smart remark. But not Batman and Superman, because Batman and Superman are icons. They're paragons. They're better than that. They're better than us. Batman and Superman are something to ascribe to. Superman, the big blue Boy Scout, with his rigid rules about everything, and his undying honesty and all the rest of it, it is something to aspire to. Batman and his recreation from Bruce Wayne into this, symbol of vengeance, the symbol of justice, incorruptible, untouchable. That's something to aspire to. When they begin killing people, then they're just killers. It doesn't make sense as heroes. These characters, for Zack Snyder and Christopher Nolan say, well, it's like they were written for babies. They were written for children. They still should be. They are still childhood heroes. What are you telling kids when Batman, just casually murders people or creates situations in which people will die? Doesn't seem to give a crap. Superman, the same thing. Superman directly killing Zod in the movie. When I was a kid, Superman and Batman were often, had this problem posed to them. the best way out of this, the easiest way out of the situation is if I just kill. I mean, obviously, if Superman killed Lex Luthor, most of his problems would be solved. If he killed Mr. Mxyzptlk next time he showed up, things would be easier for him. But that's not Superman. And when I was a kid, I liked the way Superman had to think his way through these problems. It wasn't enough to overcome these challenges to his superpowers and his many abilities. He had to think, because every single villain found a way to either thwart or challenge or negate his power. So he always had to resort to his mind. Batman, his greatest weapon is his mind. And people say, well, why doesn't he just kill the Joker? Well, that's kind of the end of the story, isn't it? The Punisher, by his nature, kills all of his bad guys. There's very few recurring villains in the Punisher universe, but that's by design. That's the way it is. But not Batman. Superman, we want to see him against Lex Luthor. We want to see him against Joker, Riddler, Catwoman, Brainiac, whoever. Same thing with Spider-Man. Same thing with all of the heroes. We don't want to see them kill. I don't know, has Spider-Man ever killed anybody? I don't want to see that. I don't want to see Spider-Man kill somebody. It just ruins the entire mystique, and it takes a lot away from the character because they're no longer heroic in the way that a paragon should be, an icon should be, in their world, in their superhero world, where the rules are different. So yeah, I wasn't following Denny O'Neil's rules. Obviously, I'd thought a lot about this on my own, and I think it's wrong. And I think I'm finding a hard time with words today. Oh, man. More coffee. It demeans the character. It tears them down, dilutes them to just make them like every other movie, badass, and just have them go around killing people. So, Green Adrenaline 6405. Hey Chuck, you mentioned in a previous video about how people shouldn't like the Joker, and it reminded me of a book of yours, and this is on the same subject. A book of yours you have yet to cover in this series, The Joker's Apprentice. Can you talk about your involvement with this project and how it came to be? I know you have such an affinity for Batman the Animated Series and for DC to include gorgeous illustrations from the show with your writing. You must have been incredibly honored. Yeah, I mean, I came up with the idea for Devil's Advocate, the basic plot line, and it was a project for Graham, and I didn't want to do it as a regular arc in Detective. And Graham was my cohort, my collaborator on that run of Detective. And I convinced him that it was what didn't take long. Convinced him that Devil's Advocate was a very special story that should have its own volume, its own book. The basic premise is the Joker is caught and put on trial and convicted for a series of murders. But it turns out that Batman thinks he didn't commit them. And so Batman goes on a crusade to find the real killer, while everyone is telling him, leave it alone. Joker's finally in jail, not Arkham Asylum. He's convicted. He's on death row. They're going to kill this guy. And he'll be out of your hair forever. But of course, Batman is Batman, as I said in answering the previous question. He's a principled guy. Number one, he doesn't think Joker should be executed for something he didn't commit. That's not justice. And he also doesn't think they should let the real killer go, which is the end result of allowing the Joker to be executed. I think one of the characters in there even says, why don't you just let them kill the Joker and then solve the crime? But that's not Batman's style. So that's what the story entailed. And how I became involved with it, I basically presented the idea to Denny O'Neil and Scott Peterson. It would be a special project by Graham and myself. And then Graham and I went to work on it. And it was one of the rare occasions where we directly collaborated in person. On our own dime, we both met in New York and spent a few days in Manhattan. basically hanging out and plotting this thing, because it really is a whodunit. Batman is very much the detective in the story. We don't know who did it. There's lots of red herrings. There's lots of various suspects and motivations. In the middle of it all, we see Joker going to trial, the trial scenes. And this was written while the O.J. Simpson trial was going on, so it seemed fresh to me working on it. And so so we have all of these things going on, and then the exchanges between Batman and Joker while Joker is on death row, Joker's experiences in prison, and there's a lot of moving parts in the story, and I'm very proud of it. And it's the kind of thing that Graham and I really had to get together to plot. I mean, it's a total collaboration between the two of us. I wanted his input, a lot of his input on the story. And of course, as he always does, Graham's never phoned it in his life, but the artwork is gorgeous throughout the entire book. It's, impeccably told. Graham's a master storyteller, as you probably already know. So anyway, I think ultimately our editor was Archie Goodwin. It wasn't Denny or Scott. And one of the greatest compliments I've ever received as a writer was that Archie said, I started reading this thing and I thought, I know how this is going to work out. I know who the killer is. And then he said at the end, no, I didn't. He says, you completely surprised me as to who it turns out was guilty of the crime. Because to me, the main story of Batman trying to prove Joker's innocence, it wasn't enough. I wanted to lift this above that kind of story, and in addition present a real, puzzling, workable whodunit. And so it's basically two stories wedded together that fit together seamlessly, because each story is part of the other. Each story is intrinsic to the other. So you have two stories running simultaneously, and I wanted to make sure both of them were solid, both of them were good, which is why I welcome the Graham's involvement here, because he's a good story guy, and we work well together, and we're not afraid to tell each other when something's not working, or I don't like that, or whatever. So we kept each other honest throughout the entire process. It was a lot of work, but I'm very proud of it. My only regret is DC really didn't market it except to say, hey, here's a book by the guys who are always doing Batman, big deal. And they just sort of dumped it out there. I wish they had made it more of an event. Not necessarily for my sake or Graham's sake, but for the sense of sheer marketing. Wouldn't you want to present this as something a little bit special? Because forget that, that Graham and I worked on it. This is the kind of story that answers a lot of questions about Batman and the Joker's relationship, and it would seem to me that it's kind of part of a Batman 101 collection of books, and I don't know why it's ever been out of print, because it just seems like a natural sell. It's never out of print in Europe, but here in the United States it's hard to find. I don't know what it goes for on Amazon and eBay. Probably a fortune, because he had low print runs on both the hardcover, especially the hardcover, and the paperback. So anyway, that's enough from me on Devil's Advocate. I'm sorry, I worked in a way to bitch about the industry, and I gotta stop doing that. Hey, it's a Hutch twin spin. Hutch says, I don't know how much you pay attention to DC's various movies and cartoons, but which adaptation of Bane do you consider the closest to your concept? He's been adapted twice in live-action movies. I hear he was in Gotham. Oh my God, was that horrible? It's like the 80s called. They want their supervillain back. He's been in animated movies like Hush. He has. I didn't know that. And I think he's been in every Batman animated series as well as Young Justice. Well, it's a pretty easy pick. My favorite would be his very first appearance on Batman the Animated Series. And a lot of that, I got to thank Paul Dini and Bruce Timm. These guys really did the yeoman work of doing the due diligence of researching these characters, reading the comics, understanding and then translating them into cartoons, through their own imaginations, but remaining true to the source material. And I think they did a good job with Bane. I mean, he has a very abbreviated origin. I mean, obviously it's not his whole story and everything else, but I was very proud of the appearance they did. And these guys would show up at the DC offices. I mean, it was a neat synergy where there was a lot of back and forth. There was a lot of sharing between Denny O'Neil's Batman office and the Warner's animation team. And there's a lot of back and forth. I mean, I took two of Paul Dini's characters and made them part of comic book continuity. And of course, I don't know who was the first person to do Harley Quinn, but Harley Quinn was brought over from the animated series. So, we wanted that give and take. And these guys would show up. You'd often find, I mean, a number of times when I visited the offices in New York, Paul Dini was there. And he was there specifically to go through the DC Comics library, which I don't even know if it exists anymore, but his huge library room that had hardcover volumes of every single comic DC had ever published. And so Paul was able to go back and basically read anything he wanted to draw material from. So I got to thank these guys for doing a very loyal adaptation of Bane. And it didn't hurt that he was voiced by Henry Silva. Henry Silva's, when I was growing up, Henry Silva was, he played psychopaths and, dangerous people of all kinds. And I was so thrilled that he was the one doing the voice. And the animated series overall was so cool because it really was, for the United States, the first animated drama that we ever saw. So it was real groundbreaking. And it was neat to be a part of it, even in the tangential way that I was a part of it. But I think Graham would agree with me on the Bane adaptation for the animated series. That's a favorite. I wish there'd be a live action version that would hew as close to Bane's source material as Paul and Bruce did. Brian Hoff, what happened to your second run on Robin? Batman R.I.P. 2007, and why was it cut short? Well, I don't know. I don't know what the reason for that was. I really don't. But I was brought back on to do Robin. I was invited by the editor, I suppose at the behest of the editor-in-chief at the time. For whatever reason, I think it was like stunt casting. I don't know why they called me. They called me out of the blue. Would you like to do a run on Robin? Then I started, and then I was about a couple of months into it, and I visited the DC offices, and somehow the editor-in-chief got inspired to hire me to do Batman and the Outsiders on the spot. And I actually wrote the first issue of Batman and the Outsiders while I was still at the DC offices. I said, "Do you have a spare? Do you have a spare office? I'm in town for a few days. I don't have a whole lot to do. I can write the first issue and get you going." So I was fired off both books at the same time, and I was never given a reason. All I can tell you is that an assistant editor was crying on the phone when they called to tell me about it. And my editor and assistant editor said they were forbidden to tell me why I was fired from both books. So I have to think it's not anything I was doing on the books, because why would you fire somebody from two books at the same time? It had to be personal. I don't know. I didn't have a whole lot of contact with the DC offices back then. I was basically just writing my stuff and handing it in. And everybody seemed happy until one day they weren't. And they called and said, "Stop writing, and you're finished, buddy. Get out of here. Don't do any more writing." Well, the problem for DC is that, I'm me, and they assigned me 2 monthlies, and I just began writing, like I used to at DC in the 90s. And I was writing like 2 issues a week for quite a while. I calculated that at the time they fired me, and they didn't use any of my scripts that I handed in, all these scripts that I handed in, particularly on Batman and the Outsiders. I got on a real run with Batman and the Outsiders. I wrote a lot of issues. So at the end, they paid me for $30,000 in unused scripts they would never use, because they brought on other writers. And as far as I know, bringing on somebody else didn't really help sales. So I don't know. I wish I could answer you. It's a mystery. I can only say that there's got to be a reason for it, but I don't know what that is. So, all right, John Batten. Which non-EC pre-code comics have you enjoyed or can recommend? Related, what do you think of the argument that says that the non-EC comics were given short shrift because Bill Gaines had the guts to testify in front of the Senate against those who denigrated comics, and Martin Goodman, Marvel, and other comic book publishers didn't? Well, I'm sure Bill Gaines regretted going before the Senate. As much as I love Bill Gaines and all the work he did and what he did for comics and and Mad Magazine, all those things, I'm sure he regrets going before the Senate because apparently his appearance was not terribly convincing. He basically hurt the cause of comics more than helped it. And I think generally that's what Bill Gaines did from the beginning. They were trying to grow comics up, show that comics were a medium that were worthy of adults' attention. But the problem is they just went a little too far. They just pushed too far with the gross out stuff and the gruesome stuff and the rest of it. Because, I mean, people say, well, it was for adults and all that. And it's like, yeah, but there's nowhere in medium outside of radio where you created the images in your head. And even then, radio didn't go as far. There's no movie, TV show, even novels at the time who pushed the envelope on horror the way EC did at the time. Even today, you look at the stories and you're like, oh my God, how the hell were these ever published in the early 50s? So they really did tweak the nose of the establishment with these books. And I admire them for it. I admire people that are subversive. And I think comics at a certain level are subversive because they're so under the radar. And they're generally considered lowbrow. So you can get away with stuff in comics you can't get away with in other medium. But it was a little too soon. I wish they had doubled down on the actual more adult material rather than the more scatological or gruesome or gory stuff they were doing. Actually, they made efforts after this to sort of grow comics up. I wish they had done a little bit of that before while they were successful, because they had the golden ticket. These comics sold very well. They had an eager audience. They had comics first organized fan base with fanzines and everything else at the time. The EC Fan Addict Club. And hold on, I got to drink water here. No cough button on Ask Chuck Dixon. So, I wish they had taken, in hindsight, I'm sure they wish they had too. And, eased off the pedal a little bit on the gruesome stuff and done more, to literally grow comics up instead of just telling these gloriously bloody campfire stories they were telling. But that said, that's what happened, and comics were hurt for a really long time. I think the comics were basically, American comics really never recovered from this. Because, we deal with adult material now, but we don't have anywhere near the sales we should have had if the medium had remained vibrant based on the efforts of these guys. Now, my favorite non-EC stuff is all Atlas. Atlas took what EC was doing and they doubled and tripled and quadrupled down on it. Atlas was putting out so many comics, totally flooding the zone with whatever was popular. And their horror comics, while not as good as the EC comics, they have their own weird feel. There's a oddness, an alien element to Atlas horror comics. The EC guys were capable of doing like groan-worthy work. I mean, not everything at EC was wonderful. A lot of it was contrived, and the quote-unquote surprise endings pulled out of thin air. Well, that was de rigueur at Atlas. I mean, everything was contrived. all of the endings were pulled out of thin air, but a lot of the art was gorgeous. You had Russ Heath and guys like that working, Joe McNeely, guys like that, doing terrific work on these books, and the art quality was high. And every once in a while you'd run across a story that was pretty good, not EC standard good, but pretty good, and I think they were the best of the pair. But the best of all of the publishers who were into horror, and everybody but DC at the time. But I mean, even Harvey Comics were doing horror. But my favorite ECs will always be the war comics, written and edited by Harvey Kurtzman. They were groundbreaking in their ability to show the humanity, the human side of war. These weren't rah-rah, hooray for our side war comics. You could say they were anti-war comics, but as I've said many times, any good war story is an anti-war story, because if you show war realistically, you ain't going to turn people off toward war, because you know what? War's not good. It's not a good thing. We should avoid war. but I love reading about it. I love military history and the rest of it. And Kurtzman was a nut for making sure everything was as accurate as he could make it, which I always appreciated. And it brings a real versatility, another word I have a problem with, a real believability to the stories, to more accuracy to weapons, equipment, uniforms, things like that. And of course, he hired artists who were sticklers for that as well. John Severin, Wally Wood, Jack Davis. These guys wanted to get it right, and they did. But the greatest thing about the war books, Frontline Combat and Two-Fisted Tales, are just the raw emotional power of the stories. There's stories in here in these comics that would make you cry. And that said, Atlas War Comics were the next best competitor. And unlike the horror books, the Atlas War books are pretty damn good. And every once in a while, they would do EC level war stories. Because a lot of these guys were fresh back from World War II, even though most of the stories in the pre-code period were about Korea. These guys had served. They knew what it was like. They knew what it felt like, smelt like, all the rest of it. They'd had their own experiences. And so, that included the writers. And so the Atlas War books, and again, Atlas flooded the zone with dozens of war titles. But they had a lot of great artists. Again, John Severin, a lot of Russ Heath doing some of his most amazing work on these titles. Joe McNeely, John Romita, Paul, Jerry Robinson, guys like that. Joe Sinnott doing terrific work. And if anything, Atlas War books were more dour, more anti-war, more sort of, painted black war stories. They were not rah-rah war comics at all. Often showing atrocities, injustices, showing what the psychological price a soldier pays on the battlefield. Taking off from the EC books, but if anything, making them grimmer. These aren't feel-good comics, which goes back to my point of creating adult, mature material in comic book form in the United States in that period. It wasn't just DC. Atlas was trying to do it as well. I mean, there was an obvious effort in their war books to appeal to an older reader. And they must have, because they published dozens of war titles. I mean, there must have been 3 or 4 new war titles a week out of Atlas, just crowding the spin rack with these books. So, this is the age of redundant publishing. So I have to imagine they must have had an enormous audience for these books, to keep producing them in the numbers that they did. So, hats off or helmets off to Atlas for continuing to carry the EC flag even after EC fell, because Atlas, until it became Marvel, continued to publish war comics all the way up to 1959, and in numbers of titles. and generally excellent work. The stuff kind of falls apart once the comic code comes in, and they're not able to be as in your face as they were. No more, flamethrowers and dismembered bodies, but they were still solid war comics. Mike Ortego. I'm a practicing Catholic, and with this new X-Men Immortal comic claiming Jesus was a mutant, I feel like I'm at my breaking point. Yes, I can and do support independent creators on things like Indiegogo, but those books can be very pricey. I'm seriously thinking about throwing in the towel on a hobby I've been in love with for over 30 years now. Any advice would be greatly appreciated, Mr. Dixon. God bless. Jesus as a mutant. Yeah, I'm with you. I'm with you, buddy. But don't give up on comics. Comics is a great medium. And I don't like it when people say, well, DC and Marvel, they're ruining comics. And there won't be any comics anymore because of DC and Marvel. Well, DC and Marvel are not the be-all, end-all of comics. Yes, they are the market leaders, sadly. They've always been the market leaders for decades. But they've given that up, haven't they? They're not interested in floating everybody's boat. They're not even interested in their own earnings. They apparently aren't interested in circulation. They apparently aren't interested in their own fandom or finding new readers or building a fan base. They just seem interested in turning off as many people as possible with their material. Jesus as a mutant? Why do that? That's a stupid idea. That's like a college philosophy major after his first beer, the kind of thought that they would have. It's just idiotic. Why even go there? So that said, DC and Marvel are not all of comics. Comics is a medium. It's not an industry. It's not a business. It's a medium. Just like music is a medium and film is a medium. There will always be comics. There will always be people who want to create comics. If anything, there's more comics. There's more diverse, and I mean diverse in the way it's meant to be said, in its true meaning. There's more diverse comics. There's a wide panoply of comics, probably more than ever before, because you have all these independent creators. And while I agree with you that crowdfunding is expensive, it's still creating comic book content. And every once in a while, you got to find a crowdfunder that you're willing to support, because you're supporting good comics. You're supporting the cause of good comics. And yeah, I agree with you. It gets pricey. But you're buying a collectible, and that's the name of that tune. But you're creating content that will be available later on in the retail environment. I mean, these crowdfunder comics, the content isn't going to go away. It's still going to be there. It'll be available to you someday at a lower price. I hate to break it to you or tell tales out of school for all my crowdfunding friends, but that's the reality. That money goes to create content. That's all it's about. And when I work for a crowdfunder guy, that's the only kind of crowdfunder guy I want to work with. I don't want to work with a guy who's only interested in creating collectibles. I want to work with a guy who's interested in creating content, and that the money he makes goes toward more content. That he or she makes goes toward more content, not a Ferrari. So that said, I mean, for crowdfunding, I'm contributing 2 stories to Graham Nolan's epic project, Giant Size Two-Fisted Manly Tales, which you can go to Indiegogo or Kickstarter and grab a piece of that. On the regular retail comics front, I'm working on I'm done working on Unprepped. It's a 5-issue miniseries from Antarctic Press. Antarctic Press is also reprinting my series from the 80s that has never been reprinted in its entirety, my series Alias, which is a series, a crime series, detective kind of thing. That's just a regular retail comic book. In addition, I have stuff coming up from a new company called Phenom, this amazing new company called Phenom, for which I've done a project called Hunter Ninja Bear. It's a period drama set in the early 1800s in both Japan and the United States, with amazing artwork by Mel Ruby, inks by Rob Hunter, Bobby C., and incredible colors, as you see, by Ivan Nunez. and that's going to be available soon. It's a crowdfunding project, but this is a 12-issue series. It's close to 300 pages of comics, so I think even the crowdfunder is going to be a bargain. And possibly, if we raise enough money, go to hardcover. I mean, we're talking a big, fat, honking hardcover historical epic, action story that I think you're going to dig. And it's all done. All the art's done. It's not one of these things where you put out your money and you got to wait 2 years. Everything's finished. Also, through Phenom, coming up after the Hunter Ninja Bear campaign is Seven Deadly Sinners. It's by me and Bob Harden. It's a project that I've had in mind for decades, and it's a throwback retro 1970s biker flick. It's my biker gang version of the Magnificent Seven, a disparate band of motorcycle outlaws get together to save one of their Vietnam buddies from the local corrupt county sheriff who wants to shut down the guy's marijuana farm. So Bob is a veteran cartoonist of magazines like Cartoons and Hot Rod Tunes and stuff like that. And I wanted to do a project with him for years, and in particular this one. And we finally got it all together. Again, this one's complete. It's completely done. It's a 110-page graphic novel that'll be available through Phenom. So don't give up on comics. There's lots of other people doing great stuff out there. Mike Barron is routinely doing some terrific comics out there, as well as a whole bunch of other creators. There's a lot of unemployed and underemployed comic book talent out there who's still at the peak of their abilities, still producing comics. So support the medium. Forget DC and Marvel if you want to. They turn their back on you, so there's nothing to feel bad about. But still support the medium. It needs your help. And if you just do that on a retail level, I totally understand. I think comics are too damn expensive myself. And you can always go to Arctunes, archaven.com, and read a whole bunch of comics for free. I mean, you can read literally hundreds of episodes at this point of a whole bunch of comics for nada. Okay, Jonathan Haley Tang. Why was Connor Hawke's time as Green Arrow so short-lived? Well, it lasted almost 4 years. But mostly it was because of this guy. No, the guy on the right. The guy on the right. They wanted to set the Kevin up as the next writer, and which worked perfectly because basically I said I can't write the book anymore because they'd given me, I forget what title they gave me, but they gave me another title to write, and that would have been 5 titles a month for DC alone. And I said, look, even I have a breaking point. I'm not a machine. Can we cut this short? And I gave them like 6 months notice. I said, I'll write the next 6 issues. You find somebody. And Darren Vincenzo got the idea Kevin Smith would come back and whatever. He would work for DC. He would take over Green Arrow and he would bring Oliver Queen back to life. He would resurrect Oliver Queen. And I was cool with that. And I helped set it up in my final stories on the book. And, but 4 years is a pretty good run. And then, I got to do a limited series later. But I think they wanted Oliver back. And ultimately, they were going to have to bring him back and make him Green Arrow again because of the television show. That's the way that works. That drives a lot of stuff. Movies and TV drive a lot of stuff you see in comics because the movie and TV people, they want those characters, vital in the comic book arena while they're working on ancillary media projects. Michael Williams, I'd love to hear about how it was to write the Batman Spawn issue with Alan and Doug and how that even came about. I've covered this in other videos, but I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. We were at a summit. Denny brought up to us that, Todd McFarlane wanted to do a crossover with Batman. We were going to do Batman Spawn. Denny didn't want to just give it to one writer because it was going to be a big royalty payday, which it was. And so he split it amongst the three of us. And the way we decided how to do it was we put our names in a hat. We put our names in Denny O'Neil's kick-ass hat, which he always wore this fedora. And Jordan Gorfinkel pulled the names out. He pulled out Doug's first, mine second, Alan's third. So Doug wrote the beginning, I wrote the middle, Doug wrote the end. Plotting, Doug and Alan cooked up the plot. I didn't have much to do with the plot. Doug spent a lot of hours on the phone talking to Todd McFarlane to get Todd to explain Spawn to him, because none of us could make heads or tails out of it by reading the comics. So he got the basis. He had all these notes he made, and he shared with us like the abbreviated TV guide description of what Spawn is. And so him and Alan cooked up the plot overnight, and then we split the scripting up. So the middle 16 pages of the book are me. And as I've said before, my only provisions were I wanted Batman to make fun of Spawn's cape. Todd said, okay, that was fine. And I wanted Spawn to introduce himself to Batman by saying, you can call me Al. And Todd was fine with that too. So it was fun. It was neat to work with those two. Obviously, neat to work with Klaus Janson. Everybody loves working with Klaus. And we had a good time. And as I said, the royalties were, well, they were sweet. Okay, what's you reading? I got one thing I want to tell you about on the What's You Reading segment, which I'm going to try to make a part of each one of these episodes. This is like, what comics have I read recently? And this one is, it's called Wipeout. It's from Jeff McComsey, who's an independent comic book producer. I've worked with him before on the Fubar series. He does the Mother Russia comic series. Jeff's just he's a triple threat. You know, he's a terrific writer, a terrific artist, and he's come up with a scenario here. It's another asteroid heading to Earth, and the governments of Earth have to come together to do something about it because it's an extinction event. But that's just the beginning of the story. I mean, the whole asteroid and landing on it and the mission and all that, that's like the first 25% of this graphic novel. Then the real story begins, because it gets a lot more complicated once they get there. And it's just a hell of a story. And Jeff has a really unusual, dark sense of humor that's peculiar to him. The only thing I can compare this to is like Dr. Strangelove, as far as really dark sense of humor. And it's possibly... It is the most compulsively readable comic I have read in years. I couldn't put it down. And this is a jaded guy who's been in the comic business forever. I can put down most things. I had to find out how this ended. I had to see what happened next. And like I said, it's called Wipeout. It's by Jeff McComsey, and you gotta find it. It's just a terrific book. And you will not be disappointed. I don't know what venues. I don't know if it's available retail. I think I contributed to the crowdfunder, but I'm sure it's in demand or retail available. So check out Wipeout by Jeff McComsey wherever you can find it. Just my highest recommendation. I can't end this without talking about Neal Adams. We lost Neal Adams recently. He passed away at 80. It's hard to estimate his effect on the comic book industry, not just on comics, but on the creative and the freelancing end. Of course, everybody knows an Adams drawing the minute they see it. There's that unmistakable style that's sort of like, it's a more realistic approach to superheroes. It's just a different feel to the superhero genre. And the thing about Adams was that he brought an emotionality to the characters that had not been present before. They were no longer, they didn't have feet of clay, but they seemed more relatable. And the changes that he made to the business, I remember my first exposure to him was these iconic covers, and then through Batman and Deadman and things like that. And he just kind of drew the superhero into the real world a little bit more. Not to the degree like hyper-realism like we have today, not to the degree of like fetishism or anything else, but he just sort of made them seem more real and more human. And Everybody was inspired by that. And the thing is, Adams really, came to the fore when I was an adolescent. I was maybe, 13, 14 years old. And up until that point, all of the comics were by the same guys. They were by guys that were doing the comics in the 40s. Adams is one of the first guys on the scene who's a totally new face. He comes out of commercial art. The commercial art influences are obvious. And it just looks different. Adams, Jim Steranko, and Jim Aparo are like the first new faces that you see in comics. And me as just a comic guy, I have no connection to any other comic fans or anything else. I can feel this, something's changing. So here's these new guys with a new approach, a new way of doing things. And, it was very exciting. And Adams was at the center of that, but he was at the center of so much. I mean, he formed his own studio, and he was very concerned with freelancers' rights. He famously got Warner's and DC to pony up some money for the original Superman creators, because those guys got screwed. And Adams, Neal Adams' greatest talent was he couldn't shut up. He had a big mouth, and I mean that in the best way possible. This guy, once he got on a subject, once he saw an injustice, once he saw an inequity, he would not leave it alone. And you would hear from him. And he could get away with it because most of his money was made in the commercial art field. He didn't really need comics. He loved comics, and he liked working in comics. But, he was into storyboards and ad art and movie posters and all the rest of it. Neal could find work elsewhere. If DC or Marvel blacklisted him, he could get along just fine. And they knew that. And because they knew that, they knew he wouldn't shut up. There was nothing they could threaten him with. And so many freelancers benefited from Neal's, squeaky wheel. And it was never about himself. He was always going to bat for somebody else. And in my own experience, I can say this because Neal has passed. He went to bat for Graham and I on our participation with Bane, the Batman villain. Graham and I felt, quite rightly, that we were getting the short end of the stick, money-wise, off of movies, TV, and things like that. That they were doing a little bit of Hollywood accounting on us. The kind of Hollywood accounting that can prove, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that none of the Harry Potter movies made any money. So we were always getting, slow walked and all the rest by Warner and DC lawyers, hoping that we would eventually go away. When Neal heard about this, he raised hell. And I give Neal a lot of the credit for Warner's and DC finally coming to the table and at least doing a little bit of the right thing. They treated us a little better after that. I mean, Neal couldn't move heaven and earth for us, but he sure helped a lot because, as I said, he wouldn't shut up. And as I said on my Facebook page, he was an inspirational artist, irreplaceable, a valiant voice for the freelancer, and never boring. So, Godspeed, sir. You will be missed. Hey, if you want to contact me for any reason, pictures of your dog, your cat, no pictures of children, please. That's creepy. Questions, suggestions, whatever, corrections, I get them too. You can contact me at brunobookstore@gmail.com. brunobookstore@gmail.com. It is the most reliable way of getting a hold of me. And while I got a hold of you, Levon Cade books, they are now available in audio. Wonderfully narrated, wonderfully read. You can get them. You can get them on Audible. I think the first 5 are available now. Eventually, all of them will be available. And I've written 12 of these. 10 have been published. I got 2 in the can, folks. Can't stop writing Levon. I love this character. I hope you do too. And as my publisher says, if you like Jack Reacher, you'll love Levon Cade. So for those of you who have long commutes or are planning a vacation drive somewhere, maybe you might want to take Levon Cade along as a co-pilot. Well, that's it for me this week. Thank you for listening. Thank you for watching. If you hit the super thanks, super thank you for that. And keep spreading the word, keep sharing, keep liking, subscribing, whatever. And I will see all of you, every single one of you, I hope, down the road.